So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for Alistair and Christopher for joining us on a Saturday afternoon from Singapore. And I'm Pallavi, I'm your host, and my colleague Shreyas will be the co-host today. And today we have Dr. Alistair Cook and Christopher Chen from RSIS from the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, who will be speaking on reimagining the humanitarian landscape in a post-COVID world. So before we go to today's session, just a brief about Asian Pathfinders and the Fireside chats that we hold. So I know a lot of you have been joining us regularly, but just a brief that we are here to bring scholars, practitioners, academics together to have constructive dialogue discussions. And I think technology has made it possible to have these kind of discussions across continents and across countries and still be able to connect with each other. So that's a good thing. And we're trying to make it as informal as possible because I think just having that kind of a space for all of us to come together and have a discussion is very important in today's times. So our guiding principles just that be an open forum for a constructive dialogue and knowledge sharing. And it's also, like I said earlier, to bring academics, researchers, practitioners together. And we also want to involve early career professionals, young professionals, for them to come ahead and share their ideas, find collaborations and possibly mentorship, and also be the future leaders of this field. So execution of this idea, we hold these weekly fireside chats on Saturday at 11, and we also have a YouTube channel and we have a few social media handles. You can find the links in the chat box, and it's just for us to stay connected and create this discussion forum, knowledge repository for everyone to tap into. And as a lot of you know, we do have a broad area of topics that we cover, and one of the reasons it's so broad and sometimes it's still so narrow is because a lot of these things in today's world are very interlinked. So it's very important for us to understand why a humanitarian assistance is important in today's world when we're talking about security issues also. And I think why we approached Alistair and Chris to come up and speak about this topic now is disasters like climate change and other kind of natural disasters related to nature and everything are still happening. We've seen that in India. We have had this 2 cyclones just during the COVID times. We've had Hurricane Hannah in US. We've had I think Delhi has had about nearly 20 plus of mild earthquakes just in this since the start of this year. Very mild, but yes, so we do realize that these kind of challenges do exist in our societies, and just because it's a pandemic, that's not going to stop, and we need to understand this. Like community guidelines, I think respect the views of others. Let's have a very mature dialogue, a more parliamentary discussion, not the Indian Parliament or any of the parliaments, but the actual Parliament, how it's meant to be, those kind of civil dialogues, and respect intellectual property. I think it's very important to do that, and that's thing we keep on stressing over and over again, that you have to respect the intellectual property of all our speakers and participants, because everyone has a unique view and they should be attributed for it. You want to use it, please get in touch with the speakers or get in touch with us, and we're happy to connect you. And basically, these are just a few of our upcoming sessions. So that's for you to see if you want to come and join any of our future sessions. And we're really glad Dr. Anil Kakodkar, for those who don't know, he's the former chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission of India, and he's been gracious enough. He'll be joining us on 12th September. So, and trust me, Dr. Kakodkar has decades of knowledge, and he has been at the forefront of India's atomic energy, nuclear energy programs. And I think it would be great to hear from him. So would it be from the other speakers. So yeah, these are just to contact us. And today's session, so we have Dr. Alistair Cook. So Al is, as he's popularly known, is the coordinator of the Humanitarian Assistance and the Disaster Relief Program and Senior Fellow at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS as it's known, at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. His research interest focus on Asia Pacific and Myanmar in particular on the humanitarian affairs, disaster governance, foreign policy, and regional cooperation. He has taught at undergraduate, graduate levels, and professional uh, development courses at Purdue, University of Melbourne, Deakin, Nanyang Technological University, Australia, National University. The list goes on. So you can definitely look up Al's long list of professional achievements on the website of RSIS. And moving on to Chris. Chris is currently the Associate Research Fellow at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at RSIS again. He has studied in University of Melbourne, where he obtained both his master's and bachelor's. And his current specialization is in the area of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. His research interests include humanitarian assistance, disaster relief in the Asia-Pacific region, institutional memory, human rights in Asia, post-migration, and there. And that's about it. So for the ones who don't know, Chris was Chris and Al I did a course with, sorry, I am getting it confused. Chris and I did a workshop with Al on crisis management, and it was a wonderful one. So Al, I do remember some bits of the crisis management things that we did, which kept coming back to me during this current pandemic, the exercises that we did. So yeah, I will let it, I think that Chris is going to speak first, and then Al. So Chris, I'm going to share the screen for you. Just let me know that it's possible. Can you see it, Chris?
Yep, I can see it. That's good.
Perfect. Over to you, and I'm going to go mute now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pallavi and Shreyas, and thank you, Asian Pathfinders, for inviting us to speak at this Fireside chat. So hello everyone, my name is Chris, and I will be speaking briefly on two trends in humanitarian action that can be observed during this COVID-19 pandemic. My colleague Al later will then speak about some of the possible initiatives that can be put into place to facilitate more effective humanitarian action in a post-COVID world. Next slide. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, yeah, so basically I just want, in the interest of time, I just want to make two points and point out two trends that we have observed in the Indo-Pacific region. My first point pertains to funding. So as we know, when the pressure's been on in the past, international development assistance programs have always been easy targets for significant belt tightening. So in this case, I think what we are observing is that a lot of the donor countries are going to reduce aid spending as a result of their own worsening finances due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So like indeed in the Southeast Asian region, with the economic fallout caused by the coronavirus, as well as various other changing geopolitical priorities, we are actually seeing that donor countries have responded in kind by reducing foreign aid. For example, Australia has actually drastically cut aid to the Southeast Asian region as part of a drastic revamp of its foreign policy priorities. In the past 5 years alone, aid to countries in the Southeast Asian region has actually been reduced by 42%. So that's I think it's a reduction from a total of 5.5 billion Australian dollars to 4 billion Australian dollars. And I mean, Australia has actually decided to shift its focus to the Pacific, which it neighbors and is actually a leading donor. So aid spending to the Pacific has increased in the same period of time, has actually increased by 17%. But of course, despite the apparent shift of emphasis to the Pacific, Australia's overall foreign aid budget has been repeatedly slashed in recent years. And just last year, I think the aid budget was barely 10% of the size of the defense budget. This is in contrast to the recent 2020 Defense Strategic Update, where Australia indicated that it will actually increase military spending by 40% over the next 10 years. I think what must be noted is that Australia is actually a leading donor to a lot of the Pacific region. and to a certain extent the Southeast Asian region as well. I think it accounts for roughly 45% of the total amount of aid given to the region in the last decade. So, and the Pacific, as we all know, is one of the most aid-dependent regions in the world. Factors such as geographic remoteness, frequent exposure to natural disasters, and sort of vulnerability to climate change some of the factors that make the region very vulnerable. So obviously, aid cuts will have obvious implications on the quality of humanitarian assistance provided to affected populations during disasters, as well as on long-term developmental programs during peacetime. And I think amidst this pandemic, it's easy to forget that the Indo-Pacific is also one of the most disaster-prone areas in the world. And many countries in the region have already experienced significant impacts from natural hazards. I think in April this year, less than 1 month after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic, a Category 5 storm, Cyclone Harold, actually devastated several Pacific Island states, including Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, and the Solomon Islands. And in May, Typhoon Vongfong hit the Philippines, which affected roughly 380,000 people. While in eastern India and Bangladesh, I think it was hit by Tropical Cyclone Amphan, which left a lot of death and destruction in its wake. So as such, we can see that like the cutting of aid funding could not have come at a worse time, because it will greatly exacerbate the effects of disasters on these affected countries. And moreover, faced with the dual crises of COVID-19 and climate change, the next few years could be difficult ones actually in terms of progress on eradicating poverty and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So I think according to a research by the University of Oxford and UN OCHA, this pandemic could actually trigger the first increase in global poverty rates since 1990. And also more than 225 million people are projected to be pushed to the point of starvation by the end of the year. Yeah, so that's on the cutting of aid funding. So my second point is on whether or not COVID-19 is actually accelerating the push towards the localization of humanitarian aid. While the localization agenda has already been at the forefront of discussions amongst humanitarians ever since the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, the concept has nonetheless suffered from uneven implementation. In Southeast Asia, for example, the localization of humanitarian action is very much contested. Some discourses focus on government capacity, so at the national level, while others sort of places more emphasis on local organizations at the grassroots level. And yeah, in recent years, we have seen shifts towards more localized responses in the region. In the wake of the series of earthquakes and tsunamis that hit Indonesia in 2018, the Indonesian government actually delivered a nationally led response with limited international assistance. It acted quickly to impose restrictions on the types of and quantity of assistance required from international organizations, and only allowed assistance to be channeled through local partners and NGOs. International actors, in a sense, were forced to step aside, and national and local actors were given a bigger space to take on greater leadership and implementation roles. And also in this also, it's important to acknowledge that the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance, the AHA Center, also played a key coordination role in the Sulawesi response. So this highlights another facet of the localization agenda, the continued and enhanced role of regional bodies in humanitarian assistance and disaster response activities. So at a time when affected communities require more humanitarian support, COVID-19 lockdown measures have actually restricted humanitarian access to people most in need. It has forced countries to focus on containing the pandemic with national lockdown measures, but this comes at the cost of hindering humanitarian action and denying aid to many affected communities in the Asia-Pacific. With overseas travel restrictions severely hampering the movement of international humanitarian workers, I think it's the need to empower and strengthen local humanitarian actors becomes even more pressing. In a sense, it's accelerated the pace of the localization agenda in many of these countries. And yeah, and this current pandemic is forcing the aid actor to adapt to a new normal in terms of providing humanitarian assistance. I mean, it's been talked about in the past, but I think now it has to be accelerated. The pace has to be accelerated. Like, I think, for example, in the aftermath of Cyclone Harold in Vanuatu, the government and the humanitarian community recognized that the response was going to be vastly different in terms of the way it was going to be run. This was largely by necessity, as problems created by COVID-19 travel restrictions, which include the forced repatriation of international staff, quarantine requirements on aid supplies, internal travel restrictions, the prevention of international search deployments. All these factors actually meant that technical support and response efforts needed to be sought from within the country itself, rather from the international partners. As such, it is evident that when facing a double disaster, localization might not just be an option for affected countries. It could be the only way to ensure that aid is provided to affected populations. When external humanitarian agencies are unable to respond because of all these restrictions, the onus actually falls on national and local actors to provide assistance to vulnerable and affected populations. I think to adapt to this new normal, there are actually a few issues that need to be considered. This is just my opinion, but firstly, I think it's important not to allow localization discussions to center around the creation of false dichotomies between the local and the international. So doing so might result in unhealthy competition between international, national, and local actors. And it also risks reproducing stereotypes and power asymmetries within the humanitarian system by placing more emphasis on Western international actors. I think, secondly, the question of how to support localized response should actually be addressed more substantially as well. So there's a need to strengthen local humanitarian capacity. I think this has been talked about at length for the longest time ever. But I think what we need to know is that this should not be a piecemeal enterprise. Like, change actually requires more deliberative and affirmative action, and should not just be passive commitments to localization. This in the form of funding. That's the most sort of practical way that local capacity can be built up. So local NGOs should actually need to have access to direct funding from donors. Going back to the Vanuatu example, national organizations actually noted that they received less funding for Cyclone Harold during the Cyclone Harold response as compared to previous responses. And the general consensus is that the step up in national and local leadership during the cyclone response has not actually been met with a similar step up in direct resource allocation. So therefore, I think it's important that the access to sustained long-term funding is actually important in the development of local capacity. And last but not least, I think while national and local actors need to continue stepping up their efforts to address weaknesses and improve the effectiveness of their response mechanisms, I think international actors also need to acknowledge the need to further decentralize their operations and devolve more agency and autonomy to their local counterparts. I think this can take the form of building equitable and sustainable partnerships with local actors, and as well as identifying areas where they can value add. So I think the point I need to make is that this does not mean that they take themselves out of the picture completely and shift the burden of care entirely to national and local actors. I think it's important to note that supporting local humanitarian action does not simply imply a reduced or non-existent role for international organizations. Because by and large, these organizations actually still have a lot of technical expertise and resources to contribute, and they have a lot to offer as well. So I think the key, to end off, I think the key towards this is to build complementary structures so that national and local actors can actually build up their own capabilities and slowly take on greater responsibilities. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And it's over to you, Al.
Hi, thanks Pallavi and Shreyas and Asian Pathfinders for inviting us here today. Before I share my screen, I think I'll just build on what Chris has been saying there. And we recently wrote in the East Asia Forum on the need for humanitarian lanes as a constructive way to think about how we can look at localization in the COVID period, particularly. And what we argued in the piece essentially was to look at the experience of the Philippines, and as Chris mentioned, Super Typhoon Haiyan. And subsequently after that, we saw the government establish what they call a one-stop shop, which is bringing together all the different components of government physically in the same space in an airport in order to facilitate the passage of goods and people. And so the one-stop shop aims to overcome some of those bureaucratic slowdowns, the misdirection, and the time it takes to get things through the process on arrival. Basically, all hands on deck, but in one single space. And so in the piece, what we argued for is that this actually works quite well, but what we want to see is to broaden that idea more and to think about a one-stop shop, not just being for government departments, but to also provide a platform for linking the international response and the local response. So providing an area where local suppliers, local organizations can have a meeting point with the international assistance. That may be in terms of money, one of the most important things, where the government provides a clearinghouse for this. It can also be a place where international response can direct their interests and funds and so on to local organizations, and to provide that meeting point basically between the two. And Chris had mentioned as well about the Sulawesi response, where we saw the AHA Center basically take over what the UN had been previously doing, which was to link the global with the national. But in the Sulawesi response, we saw the AHA Center, so the ASEAN Center for Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Management, link the INGOs and the private sector with the Indonesian authorities in order to facilitate their interaction. And then at the time, I think in the news, we saw there was quite a lot of pushback against the restrictions that Indonesia had placed on humanitarian actors responding to the earthquake, tsunami, and liquefaction response. But on the other hand, what we actually saw is that the structure and the capacity of the Indonesian government became clearer in what it was that they needed. And so it was probably one of the first responses we've seen where it forced the international aid system to be much more needs-based and supply-driven. So you didn't have a lot of people giving affected communities what they think they need. They were being told what it was that they needed. And so we've seen quite a lot of development in Southeast Asia in that regard. So in terms of our discussion, I'd be interested to hear what people think about this idea of this one-stop shop, but being for a multi-stakeholder environment. I'm just going to share my screen now, I hope, to provide a couple of points here in terms of the discussion. I presume this looks good, unless Chris shouts. So there are a couple of things here I think that we've seen recently in the international humanitarian space where we can get some lessons learned for what we're going to see in the time ahead in terms of the international humanitarian space. The first thing is that there's no point in being in a crisis and then trying to figure out who's doing what, right? So we have to focus on engaging over the longer term in terms of government actors, in terms of other INGOs, and so on and so forth, in order to share your name cards before the crisis happens, so that you've got that network built up already. And often what we see is that there is still an approach where people enter a situation and don't have much experience or understanding of the context in which they're arriving. So then it's learn on the on the hoof, if you will, when they're in the response. And this doesn't ever lead to a very effective humanitarian response. And this is really important when we consider that second point, is on the position of humanitarian principles and practice. So we have the humanitarian principles, which are generally adhered to, but in the Asia-Pacific, what we see is that there are a lot more non-traditional humanitarian responders. And what I mean by that is that they're not necessarily impartial, and they might not be neutral, but they do provide assistance to affected communities. And we see that in terms of government response, and this is largely in the natural hazards space. So I'm excluding conflict from this. And so in that space, we're really seeing a need for more constructive engagement with these different responders in the response. The third point I've made here is looking at guidance on national and international engagement. As we've seen in the Asia-Pacific, countries are becoming much more effective at designing national plans of action, designing mechanisms to say to the international humanitarian community during a disaster, look, this is our standard operating procedure, this is what we need at the moment, and here's a list of things that are needed. But the issue we have is that it's very varied across the region, and so there's no generalizable pattern in what it is. It's always very context specific, but we are seeing a lot more assertion of governments and countries in the region in saying, in taking control over disaster response. And this leads into my next point, which is about localization. And Chris already mentioned about localization and localization agenda that we've heard since the World Humanitarian Summit. And I think that the really important point here is that the idea was that localization was talking about ensuring that money is spent at the most local level possible in order to respond to a disaster or in times of conflict, so that the money goes directly to those affected without going through a lot of doors and windows and whatnot on the way there. But what we're seeing is that this isn't the experience in the region. So when we talk to local actors in the region and we ask them what their position on localization is, they will frequently say, we don't need to localize, we are local. So what are you talking about, localizing what? So the issue, I think, has also been, and it's a product of the World Humanitarian Summit, which was a global forum, and there were a lot of international and high-level actors who were there discussing about the state of humanitarian affairs. But what we didn't see was really effective action, and it's still not happening at the moment, in terms of moving decision-making power, but also looking at the where to raise money away from those corridors of power in Geneva and New York. And so essentially what we're seeing is that the localization agenda has really become about reforming UN technical agencies and INGOs. It's not really about localizing, it's about reforming or tweaking the system in order to make those dominant actors a bit more acceptable to the places in which they operate. It's not really about changing the system to make it much more grassroots-led or empowering local actors. And so this is something that we really have to think about. And one point I will make here is that within this debate, we also hear about the need for devolution or the empowering of local actors. But with action comes responsibility, right? So I don't think we're going to be in a situation where donor countries are going to give money without strings. People don't give money without wanting to know how it's being spent, right? So either the local leadership are going to have to learn, and that should be a process through which we have knowledge transfer. So from those which are really experienced in the international humanitarian space, pass on how to deal with issues over accountability and financial transparency and so on to the local actors. Or the alternative is to find money elsewhere. And so that's where we've seen the standing up of private sector. So in the Philippines, we've seen a consortium of the private sector get together in order to provide funding for disaster response. So there are a lot of things going on in this space at the moment, in which I think that give us encouragement to look at how this can be better reformed over the longer term. And my last point here is really on looking at how we think about the humanitarian system. What we often find is that the humanitarian system is rightly based on tactical and field level experience. So people who are in the field, the people who are there on the ground, so to speak. But often what we see is this is caught up in a lack of reflection. And what we found in our study over the last 3 years, where we're looking at humanitarian organizations, is that humanitarian organizations recognize that there are lessons to be learned from a disaster experience that they've just engaged in. But the people who are in the field are really reluctant to be sharing that knowledge in a systematic way. And so what we see is that when they come back, they see these kind of lessons and experiences as really being a bureaucratic or administrative burden. So there's a lot of knowledge that's not being captured in any systematic way. And given the structure of the humanitarian system, where people are often on 6-month, 18-month contracts, they turn around. So you have high staff turnover. And so once the people have gone from that organization and moved into another one, then there isn't any transferability of the knowledge that's been experienced by that organization. Now, in itself, that's not necessarily a problem, because what we've seen over the last 10 years is that people move from organization to organization, and they're still operating in the same theater or in the same situation, region, etc. And so you have a sector which has quite a lot of knowledge as a whole, but the problem is that it's not captured in any single institution, that it is a whole sector that has the experience and not really anything that is going to be transferable. And often we get a bit of what we would call a dummy in saying that because we've seen so much progress over the last 10 years in the Asia-Pacific, particularly Southeast Asia, that we think, oh, we're progressing in a positive way. But in fact, what we've seen is that a lot of people are just moving around the different organizations. And so while the sector has been fairly sustainable, once those people transfer out of the sector, whether through retirement or they go to a different region, then we're going to be caught in a bind, because a lot of those lessons will be lost because the capacities have moved elsewhere. And so we really need to be thinking right now about it in this region, that we're going to be having a real potential problem in how we respond to disasters in the next 5 and 10 years, because we haven't had an effective way of capturing that knowledge and experience that we've had over the last 10 years. So in terms of the way forward, what do I think? Here are a couple of points to open up to the audience. And I think we have seen in the region that there is development at the ASEAN level when we're looking at Southeast Asia, to really has found a niche for engagement and cooperation. So we really need to be looking at that as a way to build upon it to make for more effective action. So it needs to go beyond a state-based system and to include multi-stakeholders. We already have the APG, which is the ADMA Partnership Group, but it's effectively not very active at the moment in terms of the regional formal processes. And so we need to really think about that opportunity to engage more local actors, as the purpose of the APG was to engage local actors and not really be limited to the 6 INGOs and 1 Southeast Asian NGO, Mercy Relief. The second point is to really think about the humanitarian principles and what is it that we are standing up for when we're looking at it in terms of disaster response. Because it's very different from a conflict context. So what is it? And we're seeing at the moment, there's a lot of developments within the United Nations. At the moment, in front of the General Assembly, they have the protection for persons affected by natural disasters being considered. So there's been a lot of legal development within the UN about how to differentiate it from the conflict context. So I think this is something that we really need to start thinking about in terms of applicability of the humanitarian principles. The third point is to really look at what it is that different agencies can offer and understand what it is from different agencies where their capacities are. And so that needs to be more long-term engagement, as I mentioned at the beginning. So really to understand what it is that people can bring to the table. And we saw this in the Sulawesi response. It wasn't anti-international or anti-offshore, or whatever the different phrasings of it were. It was, if you can provide a service in terms of humanitarian assistance, then you're going to get the access that you need, right? So you have to be able not just to offer broad scope assistance, but you have to be able to show where your value add is. And so through a longer term discussion, through different regional forums in the Asia-Pacific, that this really can be achieved. And there has to be longer term engagement engaged in for that to happen. The fourth point is to really look at people-centered approaches. So what do we mean by that? It's by looking at the affected communities and understanding the local context. And this doesn't happen when a disaster occurs. It again needs more sustained engagement and situational awareness to understand what the scenario is that humanitarian actors are engaging in. And that is basically my fifth point there, promoting early structured engagement, which is trying to facilitate that. The sixth point is, again, just to reiterate the idea of one-stop shops. And we really need to be looking at the effectiveness of the Philippines in this regard and thinking beyond that. So it's not just government departments, but it's looking at the way they're organized and thinking about it in terms of a multi-stakeholder approach. And the last point is just to reiterate that for the last 10 years in the Asia-Pacific, I think we've become a bit too comfortable in thinking that we're doing very well in disaster response. And we need to think twice about that, because it's not ensured that that knowledge that we built up over the last decade will transfer to the next generation. So with that, I think I'll wrap up and happy to engage further.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Al and Chris. I think great presentations. Both of you both laid down the trends and the lessons that are learned from these disasters. And like you said, we can't get complacent just because we think we might be doing well in the last decade. So yeah, great. I think let's just move directly to the questions. We have about 20 minutes to do that. I'll let you guys pick who wants to answer the question easier. But the first question is from Beth. How do you think the concept of remote deployment, humanitarian technical support provided outside of the context, with help or hinder localization efforts?
Yeah, I think I can answer that one. Is that okay? Oh,
Sure, yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. Yeah, I actually do think that the use of remote deployments is actually going to become a more sort of effective way of engaging with local NGOs in the next few years at least. I mean, it's not new, right? The use of telecommunication technologies to sort of facilitate humanitarian action. But I think in this pandemic where people are locked down, where international organizations cannot actually send technical advisors to affected countries, I think the use of technologies will become even more important. Yeah. And okay, I apologize in advance because I'm going to use another example from the Pacific, but because my research focuses on the Pacific, right? But yeah, but in the Vanuatu response, actually, in the aftermath of Cyclone Harold, yeah, a lot of international technical support and remote training was actually being conducted via Zoom, like the platform that we're using now, right? Via Zoom for local volunteers and local NGO partners. So yes, definitely the use of telecommunication technologies will take on even greater significance, especially in the current COVID-19 context. As international aid agencies are compelled to remotely manage their local counterparts and remotely engage with their local counterparts. Yeah, so I think this will be there'll be a different change in terms of in this modality. Instead of like sending technical advisors, there'll be a greater emphasis placed on online and digital training. Yeah, so that's my shortish answer to the question.
Perfect.
I think I'll just chip in. Yeah, I don't think there's any issue with it at all, as long as it's not an end goal, right? So as long as the end goal isn't that we have operators in donor countries remotely telling local actors what to do. So as long as it's a point of transition in terms of knowledge transfer and building up local capacity, I think this is a great way for sharing knowledge and learning from experiences globally, right? We're on this call right now with people from all over the place. So we've got the opportunity to learn from everybody's different experiences, but this isn't the end goal. I think it is a point of transfer that can facilitate knowledge.
And I think another question from Beth. Do you think the pandemic will push forward the transformation required to achieve humanitarian reform? What do you think the appetite from major regional donors is to really meeting their grand bargain commitments?
It's a good question. I think initially there's the old phrase that, don't waste a good crisis in order to bring about change. But I mean, we really don't see that, to be honest, at the moment. That in fact, through the crisis, what we're seeing is as countries go through lockdown and start easing those different regulations that they've put in place, that it has been returned to business as usual. And I presume the same will happen in the humanitarian sector. And I don't mean to be a naysayer about this whole thing, but even though we've had a lot of opportunities to be rethinking this, no matter how many times we were talking about it in different forums, we haven't really been given any indication over that. In terms of the regional commitment to distributing donor funds to local organizations, we have seen in terms of Australia that has been happening a lot more, that they have been giving assistance directly to local actors during COVID. So that is certainly a positive, but whether that's transferable to other humanitarian scenarios remains to be seen. I mean, I would be hopeful that would be a signifier for longer term change in government, but I doubt it, to be honest.
Okay. Next question is from Radhika. I think given the nature of the pandemic, we have had a lot of non-state actors who are part of humanitarian assistance having to stay at home while state actors have more power and authority to respond to a health crisis. Given the constraints that COVID-19 places on non-state actors, including civil society, how do they navigate through this space? And how do you think the new normal should accommodate and identify an effective way for humanitarian assistance by non-state actors?
Yeah, I think I can answer that. I think that's a very good question actually, because I think what we're seeing is that you're absolutely right, right? Like during this pandemic, we see the military, for example, coming into play, and they are in a lot of countries. The military is actually heavily involved in distributing aid supplies, face masks, and protective equipment, for example. So but this is also not new, right? At least in the Southeast Asian region or Asia Pacific region, the military has always played a significant role in disaster response. So I think it's in a pandemic situation, it's I think it's the same thing as well. And regarding how to move forward into this whole new normal, I think L mentioned before, like we wrote a piece in the East Asia Forum, and we spoke about the potential of opening up humanitarian lanes to sort of facilitate humanitarian access for aid agencies and humanitarian actors, right? So I mean it's an idea, and obviously implementing it will not be as easy as it seems, right? But obviously, we see the bubbles, right? Travel bubbles, they're opening up around in the world. So I mean, that's where we got the idea from, where maybe humanitarian actors can actually sort of have a negotiation with state actors to try and implement these humanitarian travel bubbles as well. So in the event of any disaster during COVID-19, I mean, they can just hop on a plane and then travel via this humanitarian lane, to facilitate the provision of aid. So that's just a short answer on my part.
Okay. The next question.
Can I just chip in there? So I think it's pretty much a structural question, right, over how governments operate in their countries and how they themselves engage in normal times with non-state actors. And so it's for people in those countries to figure out what it is that the relationship they want their government to have with non-government actors and what space that they should be afforded. And we would argue that there are a lot of different skill sets available in our societies, and that it's not just the realm only of government actors, but you have to look outside that, whether it is in terms of civil society organizations or private sector, etc. That there are different skill sets and capacities that can be used in crisis.
Great. Moving to a little bit different question, I would say. It's from Ram Athavle. It's related to chemical, biological, and radiological disasters, and more specifically, these incidents perpetrated by terrorist or non-state actors. How can humanitarian aid be delivered rapidly in such instances? Are there any specific program or initiatives in this field?
I mean, that's an interesting question, but really outside my knowledge area. But I do know that when we're looking at crisis in general and crisis management, that there are, in terms of CBRN, we do have capacities in national governments and in Southeast Asia within ASEAN, with ASEAN-ATOM, in terms of building up capacity to respond to CBRN issues. And we saw this basically play out in Fukushima in Japan, right? Where we had natural disaster overlap with the nuclear power plant. So it's a really important area, and I think it goes back to my point that we need to look at what the key skill sets that different groups can provide. And in terms of CBRN, that is obviously a very specialized area in terms of hazmat and so on. So they have to work together. And if you take an all hazards approach to these different disasters or these different issues, then you would be able to tap into the necessary government capacities, whether it's the health sector in terms of pandemics or or whether it is energy and the environment in terms of CBRN. So at the very foundation of it, it's about having that broad encompassing approach that knows what the general tools are applicable across the areas, and then engaging the appropriate actors in order to add on the specifics to different scenarios.
Okay. Moving to a little bit of tying humanitarian assistance and geopolitics. We've had incidents of blocking cross-border aid to Syria, and I think keeping that context in mind, how do you see geopolitics and humanitarian aid in general playing out over the, I think, couple of years that we have?
Sure, Chris. Do you want to answer first? And then I'll go.
No, you can go ahead first. I'll add on later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of geopolitics, I mean, this is quite an interesting discussion. We had one earlier this week on the implications of US-China rivalry in terms of its effect on disaster response. I think my general observation is that at the moment, disaster response, and I'm talking about natural hazards now, that it has been fairly contained for good and bad. So it's been fairly contained in terms of there's not been any trickle down of global rivalries in this space at the moment. Yes, there are new actors, but we're going to have to understand and get used to how the system evolves with these different donors and different providers, and so I think that's just part and parcel of systemic evolution. Now, does it happen the other way? I also don't think it does necessarily happen. That the trust and this almost contained zone of disaster response doesn't necessarily mean that once you build on disaster, that you can build on disaster response to ensure more cooperation between countries. I don't think there's the trickle up either from the disaster response scenario in terms of the implications for global rivalry. I don't. I think it's a pretty weak hand if you're hanging a hat on disaster cooperation to offset China-US rivalry.
Forgot I'm on mute. I think it's going back to the race for the COVID-19 vaccine, and there would always be the lack of availability or access of COVID-19 vaccine. So will the access of COVID-19 be considered a humanitarian issue? And any thoughts on that, I guess?
Yeah, that's an interesting question actually, because we've read in the news where a lot of vaccines are currently in development, right? I think if I'm not wrong, there's currently over 30 that's being tested and trialed in the process, right? And the significant number of them are actually from private sector. So how do you actually enable, like, questions have been raised as to like who will get access to the vaccine when it's actually developed, right? So I don't think it's strictly a humanitarian issue. It will definitely be incorporated into, I mean, when aid agencies go into a country, if and when there is a vaccine, I'm pretty sure that they will have as part of their sort of starter kit, or humanitarian kit, they will definitely have the vaccine. But I can't say for sure whether or not it will be a humanitarian issue per se, because I think vaccine. I mean, say what you want, but vaccine is a lot access to vaccines. A lot of it is due to politics, right? We know about this, and yeah, so I can't say for sure whether or not it will be a humanitarian issue or activity per se. Yeah.
Just to add on here, I mean, humanitarian action happens in crisis. So vaccine is a longer term development issue. So unless it is an issue that is dealt with in crisis, and it's not traditionally a humanitarian issue, but I mean, it does build on, it can and should build on the humanitarian imperative that people should have access to the vaccine regardless of their background and the country in which they live, etc., etc. But I'm sure that as it plays out, we'll see some pretty interesting negotiating positions from different countries. But the humanitarian imperative should be there for vaccines. But yeah, we will see the usual politics play out.
Uh, the question is from Bilal. So it's for both you, Al and Chris. We are talking about remote deployment to support local stakeholder in this pandemic crisis. Then what will be the remote monitoring and evaluation mechanism to ensure the participation of local relevant stakeholders, and also to ensure the people-centered approaches are in place? Although we are using Kobo tools in certain areas of project management, which seem to not be as effective. So are there any specific remote tools or guidelines?
I mean, I think I'll throw Chris under the bus on this one. You can answer the question on apps.
Yeah, hi. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question as well. I think as Al mentioned, it's not really, firstly, what we have to acknowledge is that it's not really about international organizations or international partners. I think, okay, maybe we shouldn't use the word management, because remote management implies that, someone is managing someone that's below them, correct? But I think what we need to know is that it's a partnership. If we should be aiming to facilitate an equitable partnership. Yes, maybe local NGOs might not have the necessary expertise, but this can be built up over time, right? So remote, in a sense, the use of remote deployment and the use of remote learning resources is a way to build up its capacity over time. In terms of monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, I think this is really dependent on individual organizations, because in my research I have seen that different organizations such as WFP, UN OCHA, they have their own different feedback mechanisms or evaluation models, right? So I mean, I don't think, yeah, it's always very easy to try and say that, oh, we should have a standard evaluation mechanism in place, but I think in reality it's very difficult to actually implement it. Because I mean, there's so many different organizations, right? The humanitarian sector is like a marketplace. There's so many different organizations, each with different focuses, each with different agendas, and each with different areas of coverage. So I think having if you're telling me that you want to have a standard evaluation mechanism in place, I think that's a bit too far-fetched, a bit too idealistic for that. So yeah, I think what's important is that what we were saying is that the relationship must be one of it must be an equitable one. So both there must be an acknowledgement that you are learning from each other, and there's a transfer of knowledge, rather than one that is, oh, okay, I need to do this to tick these boxes. Yeah, so that's my take on it.
Al, any words before I move to the last question?
Sure, I guess I will say something. What we saw recently from Columbia Uni with CFEDM, so the Center for Excellence in Disaster Management in the US, was that they had a look at the civilian military space in terms of humanitarian assistance, and they identified and they stopped counting at 32 different platforms in which for organizations to engage through different online ways, whether it's an app or whatever. So I think the question needs to be a bit more about how do we have fewer platforms in which to engage, and making the smaller number more effective, because a lot of times we see that everyone comes with a great idea and wants to implement it, and then you've just got a lot of different ideas with varied effect. So they would only have their own constituencies engaging in that app. So we really need to look at a bit more global and let's have fewer apps.
Great.
Actually, wait, yeah, sorry, Pallavi, can I just add in? Yeah, I think in the chat also, the person mentioned Kobo, right? So if I'm not wrong, Kobo is open source digital data collection platform, right? So I think, okay, so the pros and cons of it being open source is that, yes, people can get involved, a lot of anybody can contribute, right? But I think the con of it is that because of the fact that there's so many different voices, so many people being involved, it's very hard to have a standardized sort of evaluation mechanism. So yeah, so that's one of the, I mean, any technology that you use, right, will have will have its own pros and cons. So I think, yeah, that's my response to that part of the question. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. Last question is by Shreyas. So I think it wraps up everything well. Can uniformity be achieved in the future of HADR response at different levels, because ideologies, local, regional, and international hegemons keep changing, and their priorities also change. So
Okay, I guess I'll go first. I mean, can uniformity be achieved? I think what we need is to be better aware at who else is around and how they operate, rather than hoping that everyone will subscribe to a particular formal code per se. We already have the humanitarian principles, which are universal. But when we're looking at, and I limit my comments to natural hazards and disaster response, that we have a whole host of different actors, right, which are not your traditional responders, so to speak, which you would think as being ICRC or MSF, etc. And so we're going to have to find ways in which to have a baseline in which everyone agrees upon, but also recognize that there are different constituencies which the actors are operating to respond to. So whether it's a government being a response to its citizens, or whether it's a NGO responding to its donors, etc. I think that just need. I think what we can hope for is greater awareness of who is doing what and why in the humanitarian space.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, I think, as Al mentioned, the humanitarian principles are the closest to what we've seen to an attempt to sort of create this uniformity, right, in the sector. But even so, I think we see a lot of organizations that, or rather a lot of different interpretations of the humanitarian principles, right? Some, the more traditional humanitarian actors that Al mentioned, like ICRC, IFRC, they have a firm commitment to all the humanitarian principles. But I mean, increasingly we see the military being involved in disaster response. We see the private sector being involved in disaster response. We see spontaneous volunteers being involved. And to what extent do these new actors actually conform strictly to the humanitarian principles? That's still debatable, right? That's still up for debate. And but you can't deny that they are providing assistance in times of need. Like private sector, I think private sector has been heavily involved in COVID-19 pandemic response, right? They help to manufacture, they repurpose their factories to manufacture masks, manufacture sanitizer gels, and the military, like as we've mentioned just now, like they are very much involved in natural disaster response and pandemic response as well. So how do we, in terms of uniformity, I don't think there will be ever a uniform humanitarian sector, but what we can ensure is that everyone are working towards providing aid to those people who most need it. So it's more of like a needs-based approach where, you identify a population that requires aid and you provide aid. So it doesn't matter how you provide the aid, but as long as the aid reaches the vulnerable populations and the affected populations, I think it's good enough in that sense. So that's my take on it. Thank you.
thanks, Chris. I think it's a wrap. So I'm going to say thank you to Chris and Al. They've spent the time today and they've given us a wonderful presentation and a lot of insights were shared. So before we close, I do want to give a disclaimer that these are the personal opinions of Chris and Al, and they do not reflect any official position of RSIS NTU. So please just bear in mind. Again, like I said, thank you, Chris and Al. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today to been such a great engaging audience with the questions. Amazing. It just gives everyone a food for thought, whoever's researching as well as who's looking at this sector. So do join us next week and stay safe and take care, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Pallavi and Shreyas again.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you both.
Bye.